Ladies and gentlemen, it's a sincere privilege and a pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Reznick to deliver our annual Selma and Lois DeBakey Lecture in Biomedical Communication. Dr. Reznick is Chief of the History of Medicine Division of the National Library of Medicine, National Institute of Health. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Rochester and his master's and PhD from Emory University. Dr. Reznick has published two outstanding books on World War I, the first being Healing the Nation, about how Britain cared for its soldiers during the Great War, and the second one, John Galsworthy and Disabled Soldiers of World War I. Dr. Reznick is a historian par excellence. He's a member of the American Historical Association, the American Association for the History of Medicine, and he's an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Please join me in giving a warm Houston Methodist welcome to Dr. Reznick. Thanks so much.
Hi, good afternoon to everyone here. Thank you so much for making the time during your lunch hour to hear this lecture, and to everyone watching remotely, and to the entire team for making that live stream possible. And I also understand this lecture is going to be recorded for future viewing, which for purposes of the lecture is a great thing with respect to what I'm going to be discussing, that is the lessons and legacies of Selma and Lois DeBakey. I myself did not have the privilege and the pleasure of knowing Selma and Lois DeBakey. I was in email touch with Lois during the last few years of her life, but we never met. So I've had the privilege of being invited to give this lecture. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Jackson, for the great introduction and this privilege. So I'm going to be looking at their life and their legacies through the lens of their papers, which I'll explain are now held by the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. I also look at their legacy through the lens of my own two eyes as a cultural historian, historian of medicine. So thank you all for coming again. For those of you who are in continuing education credits, the goals of this lecture are to explore the legacies and lessons of Selma and Lois DeBakey, focusing on aspects of their work in terms of the broad categories of access and preservation, and featuring details of their papers, as I said, recently acquired by the National Library of Medicine of the NIH. These are the learning objectives. We're going to explain the volume and the intellectual depth of these papers. We're going to understand the collaborative work of Selma and Lois in terms of access and preservation. And you'll learn a little bit about how future researchers might understand the lessons and legacies of these two remarkable women by studying their papers when they become available at the National Library of Medicine and their related records of publishing and public service. Just a few acknowledgements. We have a fantastic Pathways intern. It's a federal intern program named Aliyah Rahman, who works with us at the National Library of Medicine. I want to thank her for her contributions to this presentation, and my colleague Sarah Eilers and Dr. Susan Speaker. And we've got some image credits to the National Library of Medicine and the International Academy of Cardiovascular Sciences and the publishers of the other texts, which you'll see in my presentation. So the National Library of Medicine, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but you may not be familiar with its history. It is the world's largest biomedical library, and its origins date to 1836 with the first documented request for funding from the Secretary of War to purchase medical books for officers in the field. However, the roots of the library originated 18 years earlier than this request in 1836 in the establishment of the U.S. Army Medical Department and the appointment of its first Surgeon General, 30-year-old Joseph Lovell. It was in his office that the first few books were gathered and took their place on a shelf to become the seeds of what would eventually grow to be the National Library of Medicine over the course of now 180 years, located in multiple locations, and most recently and currently on the campus of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. This is a portrait of Dr. Lovell that we have in our collections, and this is the request for those very first few books that constitute the very origins of what is now the world's largest biomedical library. The history of the National Library of Medicine itself is a real fascinating one. If you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to go to this URL where you'll download a free copy of a book probably recognize these books. They're widely available. Arcadia Publishers was kind enough to make this book publicly accessible freely to all, and all of the images therein, which document the history of the library over 180 years, are freely available as well. And all credit to my colleagues at the National Library of Medicine, History of Medicine Division, who contributed to the crafting of this book. So please check it out if you have a chance. We at the National Library of Medicine curate our collections in a variety of ways. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but the National Library of Medicine holds a historical collection that is vast and globally appreciated. The collections span 10 centuries. They encompass a variety of digital and physical formats, and they originate from nearly every part of the globe. The collections include terabytes of born digital content, including websites, blogs, and social media, manuscripts, 19,000 linear feet of manuscripts, including the earliest anatomical drawings and the papers of Nobel Prize-winning researchers, Lasker Award winners, U.S. Surgeons General. We have hundreds of thousands of printed works, including nearly 600 Western books printed before 1501, a vast collection of audiovisuals, and an equally vast collection of prints and photographs. Many of our collections increasingly are available online through our NLM Digital Collections repository, but many of them are not because it is such a vast collection. So I welcome all of you to visit the library if you're in the Bethesda, Maryland area, or certainly to be in touch with me if I could be of service to you along with my colleagues at the library. As I mentioned, we curate these collections in a variety of ways through exhibitions, but also through our blog, which is called Circulating Now. Our blog, we're really fortunate, launched it 7 years ago, has a readership of nearly 5,000 direct subscribers and followers in the hundreds of thousands as part of the NLM social media network. I welcome you to visit the blog and subscribe. It is free. Everything we do is free, paid for by your tax dollars, and so we're privileged to serve in this way. The blog contains the voices of many people from multiple disciplines who appreciate the history of medicine as they have found value in it in their research, in their teaching, in their public service, and in their professional lives. Our contributors include librarians and archivists and medical professionals, interns and volunteers, people from all different walks of life. And we welcome you to check out the blog. And if you yourself have explored the collections of the National Library of Medicine and wish to write for us, we warmly welcome you. Just drop me a note. Happy to oblige. Among our globally appreciated collections now are the papers of Selma and Lois DeBakey. This past summer, the National Library of Medicine announced our acquisition of these papers, formally from Baylor University. This announcement also included NLM's deep appreciation of a generous gift from the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Foundation to process these papers. It's an archival term, generally for organizing them in a way where they can be available in a logical, efficient way for interested researchers of multiple disciplines. And I'll say a lot more about that shortly. The papers themselves are voluminous. They encompass over 800 boxes of material. This is a picture of just a portion of the papers as they were here before they arrived at the National Library of Medicine, where they look like this today. We have them organized in a very general way, and they're being readied for processing, which hopefully will begin by the end of this year or early next year. It will take some time, probably about 2 years, a little over 2 years, because of their sheer size and complexity. So we have a guide to that complexity because Loiss DeBakey maintained, and we have this now safely in hand, a nearly 160-page guide to the vast majority of these papers. And this is a document which will undoubtedly be helpful in the processing process. This is a shot of what we call the box list. This is how kind of a big picture way in which Loiss DeBakey organized the papers. And this is more of a bird's eye view of the entire finding aid. It doesn't really do much good, but it gives you a sense of the vastness of it. A little more helpful, and here I credit our intern Leah Rahman for helping me with this, is basically transforming the text of this PDF. So it was a typed document, which we ran through the scanner, created a PDF, and then we took the pure text of that document to create this word cloud. You've seen these around, of course, but this is particularly helpful because the proportion of the text indicates the frequency of the term. So you see there's a vast amount of material in this collection related to the American College of Surgeons, American Heart Association, the NLM Board of Regents, more about that in a moment, work in Bethesda, and it's just a multiplicity of vast subjects that we see in this collection. But what this word cloud can't convey is really what I call the material richness of the papers of Selma and Lois DeBakey. And by that I mean simply the variety of different formats within the collection: correspondence, course materials, presentations related to their many activities as teachers, as editors, as consultants, along with many, many awards and commendations. It also does not reveal the rich visual material in the collection, including cartoons that were used for their courses, which they commissioned by Dick Putney of the Houston Post, and many audiovisual materials, which, again, I'll get back to that shortly. Moreover, of course, no word cloud can reveal a life story, and I want to talk a little bit about their life story. Like their older brother, the renowned cardiovascular surgeon Michael E. DeBakey, Selma and Lois DeBakey were born and raised in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Their parents actively fostered their children's education and encouraged all of them to attend college. Selma and Lois both earned undergraduate degrees from Sophie Newcomb College at Tulane University in English and math, respectively, and Selma went on to work as editor at the Alton Ochsner Foundation and then became director of medical communications at the Ochsner Clinic Foundation. Lois went on to receive an MA and a PhD in literature and in linguistics from Tulane, and then she joined the English department there. The sisters had for many years helped their brother Michael revise and abstract his medical publication drafts, and concerned that many of his fellow physicians did not write clearly, or perhaps could not write clearly, he urged his sisters to draft guidelines and develop courses on concise medical communication. In 1962, Lois and Selma began teaching the first curriculum-approved communications course ever offered at a medical school. This was at Tulane. They moved to Baylor College of Medicine in 1968, serving as professors of scientific communications and sharing an office for the next 4 decades. At Methodist, Selma became the founding editor of the Cardiovascular Center Bulletin of Methodist DeBakey Heart and Vascular Center, while serving as editor for professional writing organizations, and she was also a guest editor of special issues of several medical journals. She was also a member of advisory committees of the Friends of the Texas Medical Center Library, and with Lois, she served on the editorial board of Methodist DeBakey Cardiovascular Journal. During the course of their careers, the DeBakey sisters supported each other at every turn. They considered themselves a team, even while Lois was a more public figure of the two. Together and independently, they taught communications courses all over the world. They also served as editors and consultants to many medical journals and to publications such as the American Heritage Dictionary and Encyclopedia Britannica. And the papers that I described to you hold a vast amount of material related to their work in these particular areas. Their courses and publications showed scientists and physicians how to write well-organized, coherent prose, free of the jargon and clumsy grammar that often characterized medical writing. As a way to influence and foster change in the male-dominated profession of medicine, and no less perhaps to temper their assertive message of necessary change in biomedical communication, Selma and Lois used humorous cartoons, like the ones I showed you, as one of their signature teaching techniques. They also wrote extensively about the responsibilities of authors and editors and reviewers and topics. They also wrote on topics of literary ethics and etiquette. Here are just some of their co-authored and individually authored papers. And when researchers have access to the fully processed papers of Selma and Lois DeBakey, they'll be able to say so very much more about these publications. How they were conceived, how they were edited, written, published, and in fact received. Moreover, these researchers will not only be able to write detailed biographies of the DeBakey sisters, but also elucidate the contributions of these remarkable women relative to the origin of the field of biomedical communications, as well as its development and change over time, and really over the last third of the 20th century. Their status, really, as icons of medical communications, to borrow the title of your colleague Dr. William Winter's tribute to Selma and Lois, published in Methodist DeBakey Cardiovascular Journal, will in fact be realized when researchers can have access to these papers, which they will. Awaiting researchers also will be the subject of Lois DeBakey in the context of her public service on the NLM Board of Regents, and as an expert to the National Library of Medicine for several years during the 1980s and 1990s. In these roles, Lois advocated for the use of acid-free permanent paper within the medical publishing industry to preserve medical records for future generations and the published medical record. She also supported the National Library of Medicine in planning its sesquicentennial in 1986 and helped to develop a public communications program to inform the US public and the world about the National Library of Medicine's collections and its resources. I'm going to say a lot more about these subjects in a little bit. So as the work of processing the papers of Selma and Lois DeBakey get underway at the National Library of Medicine, how might we begin to see them, as I described it in the title of my talk, in their own right, to appreciate their legacies and their lessons? To this end, I'd like to turn to two categories we frequently use in the library world, access and preservation. These are really two sides of the same coin, if you will, categories which capture the broad scope, indeed, I would argue the currency, of the work of Selma and Lois, how their voices were unique while also being a part of the broader ecosystem concerned with access and preservation. So this frame, if you will, this approach I'm taking to the legacies and lessons of Selma and Lois DeBakey may not be new to those of you who knew them and worked closely with them. But it seems to me, I hope, it will be valuable for introducing Selma and Lois DeBakey to a wider audience of medical professionals, educators, and writers, many of whom did not know her, know them, writers, individuals of all ages and backgrounds who, it seems to me, deserve to appreciate them and learn from their body of work. So let's first turn to the subject of access. Selma and Lois DeBakey, as many of you know, but for those of you who don't know, were passionate about plain language and biomedical communications. More than this, they were ardent, unwavering, and sometimes merciless advocates. They understood the value and urgency of embracing plain language. They told their readers and listeners the implications of not embracing plain language, and they cleverly and provocatively, they sometimes did not use plain language in their advocacy for plain language. That is to say, they intended their frequent sarcastic, if not sardonic, approach to calling out poor communication as a creative means to demonstrate the absurdity, sometimes, of that communication, and the need to remedy it for the sake of the communicators and to those whom they were communicating. We can begin to appreciate this advocacy and its nuances through the words of Lois herself, as she asked, "Doctor, are you speaking in tongues?" in her 1981 video lecture titled by the same question. And thanks to my colleagues at the National Library of Medicine, this video lecture is now freely available and preserved in NLM's digital collections repository. And you'll find it at this URL if you search the words Lois DeBakey. That's the easiest way to get to it. Let's watch the first few minutes of this video lecture.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to address the question, Doctor, are you speaking in tongues? Even if you have not given your language much thought until now, I hope to show you that verbal dexterity can enhance your effectiveness as a physician or scientist. Let's begin with a definition of paper writing from a scientific journal. Given Freud's structural point of view, paper writing can no longer be conceptualized without considering the intersystemic complications which threaten it from within. The conclusion, then, is inescapable. The paper writing function of the ego is not always the only ego function instrumental in paper writing. Under circumstances which still await psychoanalytic elucidation, scientific papers are sometimes written in a complementary part-object relationship between the paper dictating function of the writer's ego and the dictation-taking function of a scribe or secretary. You're puzzled. Is she going to be speaking in that kind of gibberish? You're wondering. Let me reassure you that I am not. I opened with that passage merely to illustrate an affliction of epidemic proportion among today's presumably educated people. What may be called, in the lingo characterizing it, lalopathy, logorrhea, verbigeration, or glossolalia, is not confined to the biomedical disciplines, but extends into business, the trades, government, and all professions. In medicine, I call this disabled language medi-cant. Ironically, the malady seems to be pedagogenic, induced by our educational institutions. It's highly contagious, passing freely from teacher to student, speaker to listener, and writer to reader. Language is largely derivative. We mimic the expressions of those to whom we are exposed. And the faulty models we have are abundant and ubiquitous. If you think the opening passage is atypical, let me cite several others, all from reputable publications. In a word, no attempt is made to distinguish between what we observe in persons who are ill on the one hand and the general notions we form in respect of like illnesses in different persons, together with the linguistic accessories made use of by us for purposes of communication concerning the same on the other. In a word, he says, 56 words is more like it, and turbid words at that. Muddled thinking is often camouflaged by a welter of polysyllabic words. For example, further, the institutions of the intellect face the task of differentiating themselves to a degree that is commensurate with the intellectual capital that has been amassed. Because science and technology are increasingly pervasive of human activity, they must accommodate themselves to the knowledge base, to the institutions wherein they can be contained, and must adjust themselves to the values that are associated with those institutional activities, and vice versa. If only that author had read Shakespeare's advice, a tale speeds best being simply told.
All right, so this video lecture, absolutely outstanding, is immediately valuable as a historical source because it presents Lois herself, obviously, in her own voice, in her own production intended for her own educational lectures, and certainly those associated with her sister. The fact that Lois spent countless hours crafting, developing, and honing this lecture is evident from her papers, as you'll see in this slide. The papers contain substantial documentation about this lecture, her evolving versions of it based on related articles, and feedback she received on it from many interested audiences. This is simply a treasure trove for future scholars who would wish to dive deep into the work of both Selma and Lois DeBakey, and certainly the particular style of Lois as demonstrated in her video lecture. Such a dive, if you will, reveals how remarkably well-read both sisters were and how they brought this knowledge squarely to bear on their advocacy for plain language and biomedical communication. To really understand and appreciate the depth of this knowledge, we need only to unpack and identify the examples Lois presented in the segment we just watched. The first passage read by Lois comes from a 1974 article by Michael Randomlisi entitled The Paper Writing Function of the Ego, which appeared in the American Journal of Psychotherapy. The second passage originated in a 1923 book entitled The Meaning of Meaning, a study of the influence of language upon thought and of the science of symbolism by C.K. Ogden and L.A. Richards, and specifically a section in that book by Dr. F.G. Cruikshank entitled The Importance of a Theory of Signs and a Critique of Language in the Study of Medicine. The third passage cited and read by Lois originates in Walter Rosenblatt's chapter entitled Science, Technology, and the University in the 1973 volume Science and the Evolution of Public Policy, edited by Jim Shannon, then of Rockefeller University and former director of the National Institutes of Health from 1955 to 68. Drawing on these examples among many others, Lois goes on to explain the pervasive impact of what she calls medicant in biomedical communication and its impact for the doctor and the patient, for their relationship, and for the relationship between doctors and the public's perception of doctors. So let's watch this segment.
Others don't understand alienates them. There is little doubt that ineffective communication has contributed to the declining image of physicians in the public press. Incomprehensible language projects aloofness, impersonality, smugness, and indifference, qualities that don't fit the physicians I know. More important, it subverts the purpose of language, communication, by creating confusion, ambiguity, misinterpretation, or obstruction. The physician needs clues from his patient, but the emotional distress induced by lack of understanding blocks the emission of clues. Medicant, therefore, has practical disadvantages. If patients misinterpret the physician's instructions, they will be unable to cooperate effectively in their treatment. And if they resent the physician's unwillingness or inability to explain the significance of their symptoms, they may ignore his prescribed treatment entirely or find another doctor. Where rapport is crucial, emotional distance may be severe. Information is power. In the physician-patient relation, the information resides largely in the physician, a situation that leaves the patient uncomfortably dependent. The fact that the information concerns the patient's own mind or body may make him feel embarrassed, demoralized, or even demeaned.
So by the time of this production of this video in 1981, Selma and Lois together and independently had published a number of articles which reflect their very deep reading, their keen interpretations, and their insightful and oftentimes very pointed explanations of the importance of plain language in biomedical communication, and certainly the implications of not communicating plainly. Among these many articles were, let's see, so this, again, this is a top view of their articles, and then you've got these selected ones, which really were those from which they drew the content of the video. And these include articles such as Every Careless Word That Men Utter, Parts 1 and 2, in the journal Anesthesia and Analgesia, and also an article entitled Medical Gobbledygook and Writer's Gookly Gob in the Illinois Medical Journal. Several years later, in 1978, they co-authored and published this seminal piece entitled Medicant, Nothing Hinders Communication as Much as Words When They Are Used Badly or Incorrectly. This appeared in the 78 issue of the Forum on Medicine. The interplay between all of these articles and the video lecture they would inform is really another aspect of the legacy of both Selma and Lois DeBakey, which future researchers will be able to explore in much greater depth than I'm able to this afternoon when their papers are fully processed and available at the National Library of Medicine. To my eye, this exploration can begin fruitfully by listening very carefully to Lois. Just recall the first video clip when she acknowledges that, quote, "Lolopathy is not confined to the biomedical disciplines, but extends into business, the trades, government, and all professions," end quote. Herein, Lois is recognizing that while Medicant is a problem, a big problem in the field of biomedical communications, it exists as such as part of the broader contemporary literature which addresses failure in communication and ways to remedy that failure. Indeed, the importance and value of plain language. Contemporaneous to the unique writing and the unique advocacy, and indeed the unique voices of Selma and Lois, were a multiplicity of works which addressed failure in communication and the importance and value of plain language. So from this vantage point, a future research topic in the papers of both of these women deserves to be how their body of work, and a vast body it was, can be part of and is part of a long historiography of plain language. How did their voices argue and intersect with and depart from and advance this broader literature on the subject of plain language? Or access, if you will, access to understanding, access to good communication. So consider just a few of the general style guides which have appeared over the past 5 decades, whether it's The Careful Writer by Theodore Bernstein, or Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace by Joseph Williams, or my own favorite, one of the most familiar ones to all of us, The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. Also in the field of law, there's a book called Language of Law by David Mellenkopf. You have Plain Talk, Clear Communication for International Development by David Jarmuel, and a book by William Lutz called Doublespeak, and there was a sequel called The New Doublespeak. So these are just a few of the books that appeared at the same time Selma and Lois DeBakey were writing and publishing and advocating for plain language. So my point here is the future research on their papers will be very fruitful when people look very critically at what they were doing unique to the field of biomedical communications, as they called Medicant, and they read their progress and their impact in the field of biomedical communications relative to these other fields, as others were trying to achieve plain language in other disciplines as well. What this does is it really augments the importance of their work, not only for the field of biomedical communications, but also as part of this larger ecosystem. They were attuned to this ecosystem. They knew they were a part of it, Lois's own words, as I quoted, and I think that allows us to understand and appreciate them all the more. With regard to the subject of preservation, well, the sisters were concerned about access via plain language in the ways that I've described. They were equally concerned with the preservation of this plain language. That is to say, really, the very paper upon which biomedical professionals published their research. In essence, Selma and Lois understood, and they wanted their readers and listeners to understand very clearly, that achievement of plain language partly, if not fundamentally, depended on retaining this knowledge, preserving it for the present and the future. Since the written word was the primary medium through which individuals communicate and share their language, they argued, we need to ensure that the written word, ideally and clearly the plainly written word, is properly preserved to be communicated. This was their overarching argument. And to appreciate their perspectives on preservation, we need to look no further than their seminal article, Our Silent Enemy, Ashes in Our Libraries, which appeared in the Bulletin of the Medical Library Association in 1989. And here I want to take the same approach in allowing these two remarkable women to be in their own right and their careers in their own way by quoting from this article extensively. So please indulge me, because what they said in this article is truly important and has great currency today. In this article, Selma and Lois began with a provocative statement and an essential question. Scholars, scientists, physicians, other health professionals and librarians face a crucial decision today. Shall we nourish the biomedical archives as a viable and indispensable source of information, or shall we bury their ashes and lose a century or more of consequential scientific history? To this question, they posed clear facts. Biomedical books and journals published since the 1850s on self-destructing acidic paper are silently and assiduously scorching on our shelves. The associated risks for scientists and physicians are serious. Incomplete assessment of past knowledge, unnecessary repetition of studies that have already led to conclusive results, delay in scientific advances when important concepts, techniques, instruments, and procedures are overlooked, faulty comparative analyses, or improper assignment of priority. And they continued. The archives also disclose the nature of biomedical research, which builds on past knowledge, advances incrementality, and is strewn with missteps, frustrations, detours, inconsistencies, enigmas, and contradictions. The public's familiarity with the scientific process will avoid unrealistic expectations and will encourage support for research in health. But a proper historical perspective requires access to the biomedical archives. Since journals will apparently continue to be published on paper, it is folly to persist in the use of acidic paper and thus magnify for future librarians and preservationists the already Sisyphean and costly task of deacidifying their collections. And further, they argued our plea for conversion to acid-free paper is accompanied by an equally strong appeal for more rigorous criteria for journal publication. The glut of journal articles, many superficial, redundant, mediocre, and otherwise flawed, and some even fraudulent, has overloaded our databases, complicated bibliographic research, and exacerbated the preservation problem. Before accepting articles, journal editors should ask, if it is not worth preserving, is it worth publishing? And they concluded, it is our responsibility to protect the integrity of our biomedical records against all threats. Authors should consider submitting manuscripts to journals that use acid-free paper, especially if they think, as most authors do, that they are writing for posterity. Librarians can refuse to purchase journals published on acidic paper, which they know will need restoration within a few decades and will thus help to deplete their budgets. All of us can urge our government to devise a coordinated national conservation policy that will halt the destruction of a century of our historical record. The battle will not be easy, but the challenge beckons urgently. The choice is ours. We can answer the call, or we can deny scientists, physicians, and historians the records they need to expand human knowledge and improve healthcare. These are really powerful words. And with this article and the related works and advocacy, Selma and Lois DeBakey answered very well the call to action they defined so very well in this article. They constructed their argument in the rest of this article methodically and convincingly, and they asked these key questions, and they answered each one thoroughly. Future scholars will explore in detail how, in fact, they answered each of these questions with their approach and their rationale and their underpinning perspectives. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but I want to look at how they answered the first two questions, because I think this exploration opens a window onto the professional character of Selma and Lois and why their legacy is important and worth studying. They began to answer the first question, why is preservation necessary, with a question. Why does the durability of paper deserve our attention? And they responded, for intellectual, historical, social, cultural, political, and economic reasons, among others. One of the characteristics that distinguishes the human race from other members of the animal kingdom is the ability and desire to record information for posterity. to produce a collective memory that spans centuries, cultures, and national borders. Paper has been a primary medium for recording the history of our civilization, so its durability is of paramount importance. The benefits humanity derives from this historical record are numerous and well-known, evident not only in more creature comforts and aesthetic and intellectual pleasures from art, literature, and music, but also in our improved health and well-being. As Cicero aptly stated, history is the witness that testifies to the passing of time. It illuminates reality, vitalizes memory, provides guidance in daily life, and brings us tidings of antiquity. Part of that history, the record of biomedical science, is our special concern here. They continued with a bevy of historical facts about preservation imbued with historical meaning and significance. They wrote, some writings of 35,000 years ago on cave walls and clay tablets remain in good condition, while a 1912 work of Heinrich Ibsen's and even later works of literature are already discolored and brittle. Paper manufactured in 1600 is still good, but after chemicals and mechanical processes were introduced into the manufacture of paper, its quality began declining. Less than 10% of materials published in the 1660s are embrittled today, whereas several-fold that percentage of those published after 1860 risk embrittlement. Thus, the only publications we can expect to remain intact are those published very early and the comparatively few printed on acid-free paper since the 1970s. Yet, in the early 1980s, only about 25% of paper used for books was acid-free. A book published today on acidic paper has been estimated by some to last only about 30 years. And again, they wrote this in the mid to late 1980s. So to their next key question, why preserve scientific publications, Selma and Lois began their answer by stating that the past is prologue. We heard about this in Dr. Mack's presentation earlier today. But Selma and Lois wrote, to ignore the silent enemy in our midst is to degrade the work and wisdom of our predecessors, to consign past ideas and observations to passive euthanasia as we exult over the wonders of modern high technology is presumptuous. Without past knowledge, those wonders would not have occurred. How do we place present knowledge in proper perspective if we go blindly forward in loose cannon fashion without absorbing, assessing, and assimilating all previous knowledge on a subject? The proliferation of such isolated observations without proper interpretation may massage the egos of individual workers, but ill serves science and humanity. Among the specific reasons why libraries in the medical profession should preserve scientific publications was, Selma and Lois agreed, their historical value. In the pages of the scientific archives are much of interest and value to historians. Human drama of the psychosomatically, chronically, and gravely ill, of scientific rivalry and deceit and bitter debate, of the courageous who self-experimented or toiled day and night in tiny, ill-equipped laboratories, patiently pursuing some scientific truth. These are remarkably powerful words. Additionally, they argued the preservation of scientific publications needs to happen for the sake of bibliographic research because, they wrote, the responsible investigator begins each prospective research project with a thorough bibliographic search of previous publications on the subject under study. It also needs to happen to help the biomedical scientific enterprise, as they said, avoid dangers of overlooking previous work, and for the sake of the greater good, they described it, encompassing editors, reviewers, the press, and the public. So, like their unique voices, which advocated for plain language in biomedical communication, therefore, their voices speaking out very loudly and clearly and passionately about preservation were part of a contemporary chorus, if you will, a chorus of voices on this vital issue as well, the other side of the coin. Around the same time they were working on their seminal article, Our Silent Enemy, the National Research Council was preparing and publishing, they did in 1986, Preservation of Historical Records. A gentleman named Barclay Ogden, who's today Director for Library Preservation at UC Berkeley and previously associated with the Commission on Preservation and Access, was researching and writing a piece entitled On the Preservation of Books and Documents in Original Form. And several years later, during the 1990s, Graham Matthews published a very important piece called Surveying Collections, The Importance of Condition Assessment for Preservation Management. This was in the Journal of Librarian and Information Science. So appreciating that the preservation advocacy of Selma and Lois DeBakey depends in part on appreciating how their advocacy on this front was itself part of this broader conversation. which really it was, how they achieved their goal in the field of biomedical communications uniquely. So Lois herself answered the call for preservation in another very important and impactful way. She did so by serving as an expert consultant to the National Library of Medicine, whose congressionally mandated mission involved, and still involves, preserving biomedical communication in all of its forms. Any serious study of her own legacy will need to consider her enthusiastic support of the National Library of Medicine on this front and her influence in the establishment and achievements of the NLM's Permanent Paper Task Force, which grew out of the NLM's earlier strategic planning around preservation of its vast collections. Established in 1987, the task force was composed of commercial, academic, and professional society publishers, as well as editors and authors, paper manufacturers and distributors, printers, librarians, and preservationists. This task force sought to make publishers and printers aware of the problems of acidic paper use and its solutions, basically taking one step further all of the principles and practices that they laid out in their article. To help authors and editors with their concerns about making their works lasting by using acid-free paper, and to alert professional societies to the need for permanence of their publications. Also to encourage the application of realistic standards in the making and use of permanent paper. By disseminating information about acid-free paper use, the Permanent Paper Task Force helped to resolve the problem of acidic paper and facilitate the preservation of the printed record in biomedicine and other fields of scholarly endeavor. The task force, and in fact the advocacy of Lois DeBakey, who's pictured here as part of this group, also helped the National Library of Medicine to become really a recognized leader in national efforts toward the adoption of acid-free paper. And Lois's advocacy for the NLM overall drove greater public awareness of the library and its collections and resources at the time of its sesquicentennial in 1986. So as Lois supported the role of the National Library of Medicine in preserving the record of biomedicine, she also wanted the public to benefit from this record through the best possible access to this record. So she was concerned about making sure it's available for future generations, but she also recognized the value of the National Library of Medicine as a resource today to provide plain language resources for the advancement of healthcare. So, in the course of their advocacy for the currency of biomedical communication, access on the one side, as I showed you, in the form of plain language, and on the other, preservation of the very words which constitute plain biomedical communication, Selma and Lois were provocative and pragmatic, unrelenting, and in fact, impactful. Importantly also, and this perspective to me is one of the most important in examining their career and their legacy, is the fact that these two remarkable women were, in essence, humanists. They were believers in the very agency of human beings, and in particular, biomedical professionals of multiple backgrounds, multiple disciplines within the biomedical profession, to think critically and proceed empirically in biomedicine so that its outcomes could be as meaningful and impactful as possible to society. Indeed, drawing on the title of Lois's 1987 and later 2004 book, co-authored with Phil Manning, Selma and Lois together appreciated what the humanities and humanities training can and in fact should offer the field of biomedical communication as a means of preserving the passion for medicine as fundamentally a humanitarian enterprise. The associated and inextricably linked careers of Selma and Lois DeBakey stand on their own, and they deserve to be studied in a far more focused way than time has allowed me to do today. I hope that what I've offered, however, will begin to frame their historical significance and legacy as we can see it today in reliable plain language resources in the field of consumer health, such as National Library of Medicine's Medline Plus and other resources produced by the government to advance individual, community, and public health overall. I also think that their legacy will help us really understand and appreciate the importance of preserving the biomedical record for today and for the future. And in fact, the National Library of Medicine continues to do this robustly with our analog collection that I showed you, as well as our born digital collections as well. So in early 2016, Methodist owned Dr. William Winters, who's here, privileged to meet you, sir, over dinner last night, published his ode to Selma DeBakey in the Methodist DeBakey Cardiovascular Journal, following her passing in March 2013. Dr. Winters wrote, quote, "Her memory has been etched indelibly on the minds of those fortunate to have crossed her path." Dr. Winters began this tribute, and his words are a fantastic currency today, because by studying the papers of Selma and Lois DeBakey, the legacies and lessons of both women, I believe, will be etched in the minds of researchers who will undoubtedly explore the significance and impact of their work for the field of biomedical communications, for the larger ecosystem of concerns about access and preservation, and for humanistic approaches to science and medicine in our increasingly data and technology-driven world. Those are my comments, and I thank you all again for listening and for learning a little bit more about the life and legacies of Selma and Lois DeBakey. Thank you.
Simply outstanding, simply outstanding. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'm sure the audience want to query Dr. Reznick. Dr. Winters?
Last night we were talking about what you might do with this information in the future.
Hang on just a second, Bill.
Last night we talked briefly about what you might do with this information in the future, and you discussed the possibility of a publication of her philosophy and her works in a bound written volume that people could read. It struck me as that would be something that would be extraordinarily useful for generations to come, because their work really represents the Bible of scientific writing.
Thank you. And I enjoyed our conversation tremendously. Yes, indeed, I have thought about collecting many of their works, both with respect of access and preservation. And by the way, that's a arguably simplistic way to look at the depth and breadth of their work, but it's helpful to me because I did not have the privilege of knowing them, and as a historian coming at a subject, one often in any field has to find the right frame to make sense of what you're dealing with. And so I use that frame. And in doing so, as we discussed last night, the idea of collecting their works, selected writings, is a very exciting one to me, because I think the words, as I read them as a historian, as one who's interested in cultural heritage, I find them very, very powerful, very, very current, very educational, and I think other generations could benefit from reading them and learning about what they had to say. So I would agree with you, and I hope maybe I could take on that project. Of course, it's dependent on copyright in the work, and I think if I could find the right permissions to secure the copyright and approach the publishers, if they in fact hold the copyright, it'd be a wonderful project to undertake. So I appreciate you asking about that. Thank you.
Comment on the challenges of preserving digital records now. On one hand, they're always available to many more people, and yet in another sense, they're very ephemeral and at risk for loss.
So the questions about preserving digital material, let me address that by honing the question a little. When you go on the internet and you watch videos and you read blogs and you look at social media, in fact, all of that is what we call born digital versus a book, the way we traditionally understand it as born analog. That's a term people use. So the born digital content is proliferating every second of every minute of every day, as we all know. That born digital content needs to be preserved in a variety of ways so it can be studied by future generations, people of multiple disciplines. So we understand the human condition broadly understood in this first quarter of the 21st century. The National Library of Medicine has a robust collecting initiative with a product called Archive It, which allows our archivists and our librarians and our curators to select certain born digital content with permissions to preserve that for future researchers. We collect around disasters, we collect around certain public health initiatives, we collect around certain disease outbreaks such as the H7N9 flu outbreak. So we have to be very selective in how we collect these things because it's a very complicated task. We go out on the web and we plant what are called seeds using this Archive It tool to pull in the digital content and capture it in a way where it can be, if you will, frozen and then usable at a later date, because those born digital resources may not be around in 6 months, a year. A link that you go to, a URL you might go to now may not be around tomorrow, next week, next year. So certain material that relates to the issues of health, public health, that are part of our collecting mandate, congressionally charged mandate to collect around health and public health, we will collect around certain subjects. So we have a team of people actively doing that. More generally, the Library of Congress also has a robust born digital collecting initiative, as does the Internet Archive, collecting larger, vast portions of the internet so that our successors, our future people who follow us can understand how we lived and how we worked and how we were healthy and how we were sick generations from now. So I'm happy to share more information about that, but it's a challenge. We're at the National Library of Medicine, we are acutely aware of it, and we are actively embracing the challenge and achieving a lot in that collecting arena.
Jeff, we've got a question.
Yeah,
Certainly.
thank you.
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry, I came in a couple of minutes late, so I
Uh-oh.
hope you didn't follow. So mine is a pretty similarly related question relative to digital media. In your research, did you find comments from the DeBakey sisters about how they felt about the proliferation of digital publishing and digital media? What did they think of this explosion of media? And secondly, what did they think about images as part of the, did you come across anything about how they felt about images or other forms of recorded health history in terms of diagrams, video, or photographs, things like that? Do they feel equally strongly, or what do they think about those things?
So with regard to your first question, I thought a lot about incorporating that question into my final comments in my presentation, and I chose not to, because I wanted their words to stand on their own during the time that they wrote. At the same time, in Preserving the Passion, the 1987 and then reprinted 2004 book that Lois wrote with Phil Manning, there are several sections about email. And in that book, in the 2004 edition, the sections about email, I think, reflect how they felt about the proliferation of technology on the doctor-patient relationship, looking at some profound negatives in the use of electronic communication in that relationship and how doctors communicate with each other and with their patients, but also positives in terms of the rapidity of the conversation, the information, how they can quickly reach patients and answer questions, but with a lot of caution and a lot of skepticism, I think. In their papers, in the very general way in which I was able to look at them, I did not see anything else about electronic communication, certainly not social media, because it wasn't around then. With regard to your next question, in portions of the papers related to the Dick Putney cartoons, I believe there are reflections about the currency or the utility of images in communication generally. I can't say more than that, but I think they did think deeply about images as a tool for education and for training, and certainly remedying what they called Medicant. So, yes, sir.
Thank you. Does the library collect email? I know it wouldn't directly relate to the DeBakey sisters, but what is the stand on email when a generation ago it would have been a letter?
Right. So I referenced that we have 19,000 linear feet of manuscript material. So these are the papers of individuals of prominence, leaders in medicine and public health. We have vast amounts of correspondence. Over the past 20 years, we've collected in a very selective way emails that would be initially printed out as part of the collection, but we're experimenting now more with how to capture that email in a system so that one day someone can come to the library and go through it in its born digital form. This is a challenge because of the volume of the electronic communications, and oftentimes a scientist who's in a lab, they're communicating via email about their scientific work, but also about maybe what they're having for dinner that night, or picking the kids up at school or something. So parsing that out in an analog format is challenging. That's the process of processing processing papers. Processing it virtually, whether it's email or whether it's social media, to the other gentleman's question, that requires a lot of archival work, a lot of very careful curatorial work to be able to capture the material and organize it in a way that makes sense for future researchers, and certainly with respect to privacy concerns.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you,
again.
Dr. Jackson.
What a great lecture, and we get you the video feed and everything. And